Hello everyone, my name is Barbara Boron. Today we'll talk about the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan on March 11, 2011. First, I'll talk about the purpose and objective of this presentation, and I'll also cover and explain the most important details surrounding the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and I'll also present the environmental and economic impact of this disaster on the Fukushima region. Purpose and objective. After this presentation, you should be able to explain confidently the event leading up to the Fukushima accident, as well as demonstrating the various environmental and economic impact of the disaster. Lastly, you should be able to explain what the Japanese government did or currently is doing to mitigate the consequences of the Fukushima accident. So, what happened? On March 11, 2011, at 1446, Japan was hit by a major earthquake of magnitude 9.1. The quake was so forceful it shifted the earth off its axis, which triggered a 46-foot tsunami which swept over the main island of Onshun, killing more than 18,000 people and wiping an entire town off the map. At the Fukushima nuclear power plant, TEPCO, the tsunami crushed the seawall and flooded the entire facility, disabling its power supply and flooding the backup generator that were supposed to generate current to maintain internal temperature of the nuclear reactor. In the first 5 days of the disaster, TEPCO facility would experience a series of nuclear explosions, causing workers to be injured and an entire region to be evacuated. Timeline of the event. As explained earlier, on March 11, 2011, there was a major earthquake which caused the TEPCO facility to to be completely flooded and the power plant rendered useless. On March 13, 2 days later, the INES declared level 4 incident, which would be raised to level 7 a month later, the same level as Chernobyl. It is determined by nuclear experts to be the most complicated accident of its kind ever to occur. 9 months after the original incident, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission confirms that the reactors are now stable. However, despite the nuclear reactor being stable, Japan will suffer from the consequences of this event from decades to come, which I will explain later in this presentation. The Fukushima nuclear power plant made news headlines for weeks. Many people were injured, displaced, or killed. One important fact to highlight is that the majority of people who died was a direct consequence of the tsunami and earthquake that preceded the nuclear explosion. Less than 0.01% died from the a direct interaction of radioactive exposure, as shown in this pie chart here. Displacement. This bar graph shows the number of people that were displaced in Fukushima. These numbers are much more higher if you consider the region surrounding Fukushima. Many of these people were displaced there as well. Over the past decade, the Japanese government have tried to encourage Fukushima citizens to return to their home, but so far, many of them refuse to return by fear of an event like that happening and in fear of radioactive particles still in the soil. Environmental impact. To understand radioactive decay, I created this line graph that showed differences between iodine 131 and cesium 137. Iodine 131 half-life is about 8 days, which means that the entirety of iodine radioactive residue is completely gone in that region. However, the half-life of cesium is 30 years, which means that the majority of the cesium radioactive particles are still present and will be there for a very long time. They are present in the soil, plant, seafood region, and these regions are being closely monitored. For example, at a school in Fukushima, at the cafeteria, the chef has to test every ingredient before cooking them, test for radioactivity, because kids are very, very vulnerable to radioactivity. The IRSN motion image map on the left showed how the radioactivity was dispersed throughout Japan and neighboring countries over the weeks following the incident. From March 12 to March 14, the first radioactive plume was carried to the wind in the Pacific Ocean. The air the air current changed and the next plume reached Tokyo region on the 15th. On the same day, major release was dispersed in the northern east region, as you can see with the arrow on the map here, causing important radioactive deposit on plants, soil, and lasted for about 2 weeks. On the image below, you can see how it has spread out throughout the international seas. You can see he reached on March 16. Radioactive pollutants reach North America. On March 21st. It reaches Northern Europe. On March 24th, it reaches France and Central Europe. Economic impact. Tirelessly, the Japanese government is trying to rebuild the Fukushima region. This initiative comes at a very high price. As shown here, the Great East Japan region suffered damages that cost around 210 billion American dollars at about 4% of Japan's gross domestic income. To rebuild these facilities, it's costing Japan as much more money to rebuild them and make it safe for the citizens. A decade later, Fukushima region is still radioactive. Less than 30% of the region population has returned to their home. School are empty, and to go to that region, you need special authorization. And it left the majority of Japanese very skeptical about the usage of nuclear energy. Summary. In summary, you can see the negligence of the TEPCO company and the natural disaster caused the Fukushima nuclear disaster, which killed 18,000 people and 160,000 more displaced. The government spent billions of dollars in reparation, and the disaster had environmental impact at the international level. And these impacts will last for decades. And these are my references, and thank you for listening.